Thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to see such a good turnout. My name is Jeffrey Grossman. I'm the chair of the German department here at UVA. And I don't want to talk too long. I just want to thank briefly the Institute for World Languages and Miao Fan for organizing the talk, and for our guest speaker, Heidi Byrnes, for coming down from Washington. Briefly, I'll just say that of all the people in the room, I'm probably the person who's least involved with the study of second language acquisition, although I teach in the German department. I do teach German at times, more at the advanced level, at this point in my professional career, professional life. But I will say that as a graduate student, when I was very much involved with teaching German and second language acquisition, this is some years ago, the name Heidi Byrnes was a name that circulated as one of the foremost scholars working in this field. And although I've read the name and read works, I had never actually had the opportunity until today to meet her. And just want to say that I'm very much, for that reason, looking forward to the talk. Briefly, I'll tell you that Heidi Byrnes is the George M. Roth Distinguished Professor of German at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on adult 1.2 literacy acquisition, particularly at the advanced level. Under her leadership, her department created an articulated 4-year genre-oriented and task-based curriculum, a project addressed in numerous articles, for instance, appearing in Applied Linguistics Review, Language Teaching, Linguistics and Education, and MLJ. And in the co-authored monograph, Realizing Advanced Foreign Language Writing Development in College Education, Curricular Design, Pedagogy, Assessment. She has edited and co-edited books and special journal issues on the development of advanced literacy and the link between language and thinking, particularly in writing. Her most recent book-length publication is a co-edited volume, Task-Based Language Learning, Insights from and for L2 Writing. Apologies, I don't have my reading glasses on. I thought it would be easier without them, since you're all out there. She is a member of several editorial boards, is a past president of AAAL, and is a recipient of numerous professional association awards, including the Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award of the American Association of Applied Linguistics, and Georgetown University's Lifetime Research Achievement Award for 2014. Heidi Byrnes currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Modern Language Journal. And today we'll speak about developing proficiency in global context considerations for collegiate foreign language programs.
Thanks. Thanks very much for this invitation, and thanks very much for coming on this afternoon, where you could actually be walking outside because it's not stormy and rainy anymore. But you did decide to come here, so I am going to be appropriately provocative while I have you here as a captive audience. The reason why I chose the topic, and I should amend it ever so slightly as far as the title is concerned, when Miao invited me to come here, I was actually in Oxford at the time, and I said, there's no way. The entire fall semester, and quite frankly, the entire year, is completely booked. So then, of course, insistent lady as she is, she continued the negotiations, and we then came up with this date and then a title and all. And the title that I gave her is actually one that was generic as far as the use of the word proficiency is concerned. But from what I know now, proficiency is used in a very technical sense here. So I took the opportunity to update the title a little bit so that it would move away from its generic sense. And we have front row seating, orchestra rows at a same price as the back seats. Here's a nice chair. You may take that one. It's really nice. So I adjusted it ever so slightly, and I'm calling it this. And for those of you who saw the previous title, you will see what I'm doing. The title now is Developing Multiple Literacies Instead of Proficiency in Global Contexts, Considerations for Collegiate Foreign Language Programs. A minor, but to some extent, I think, a significant change in the title. What I want to do is recognize the fact that you have a new center here, a new institute, and new institutes like that, of course, have expectations associated with them that the university typically has, and they also have expectations associated with it by the very folk that run the show, which is you, under Miao Fen's directorship. What that also means is the challenge and the opportunity to rethink a number of things. So I will use that opportunity to invite you to do that. And as I understand it, there will be the possibility for question and answers afterwards, and you should shoot, and you should ask, and you should do anything that you feel like doing, commenting, querying, wondering out loud, rejecting anything. That's great. So here we are. Focus is on, ultimately, the focal point is globalization. And of course, one of the first questions that one would then ask is, so what has globalization wrought here? And what might it mean for the topic that we're dealing with? And clearly, globalization is this many-splendored animal with many heads and many legs, and you can come at it from various and sundry perspectives. For our discussion this afternoon, I will say that major delimiting issues that will allow us to talk about globalization is, number one, focus on its implications for our understanding of the nature of language. In other words, we're not talking about economic issues, we're not talking about any number of other things that are obviously globalization related. I'm going to say, what does globalization mean for our understanding of the nature of language? And I'll toss out a number of things that may actually seem a bit unfamiliar to you, maybe even challenging to you, but why not? And the first thing would be that what globalization does, and I will explicate that throughout the remainder of the talk, it foregrounds the fact that language is a semiotic system. And for those of you who don't necessarily trade in such language, I translated it as a semiotic system being a meaning-making system. And in the context of language teaching and learning, I will say one of the key distinguishing features here that globalization foregrounded is meaning-making systems versus formal systems. And a significant amount of the work that has been done in applied linguistics, both in the theoretical sense and in the empirical research sense, and certainly in the pedagogical sense, continued to dichotomize meaning and form. And I'm sure you've seen plenty of that. Over here is meaning, and over here is form. And what is showing up quite strongly, not that we didn't know it before, we did know it before, but now we can't escape it anymore, is the centrality of the role of language as a meaning-making system, as a semiotic system. And I would immediately add to Jeffrey's introduction that my interest is not language acquisition in the narrow sense. As a matter of fact, I usually rebel against that kind of a categorization, but I won't do it here. I will instead say the issue at stake is how do we understand language as a meaning-making system, which immediately gets at the heart of the problem in most collegiate foreign language departments, namely the dichotomy between the folks that do the language teaching and the fine folk that do the rest of it, if I can pitch a little bit of poking into the system right away. The dichotomy between language teaching over here and content teaching over there. And to me, that is not only problematic intellectually and theoretically, it is extraordinarily problematic with regard to how programs present themselves. So that's sort of where I will be coming from and where I will be pushing buttons. So, after we have said that language is a semiotic system, that it's a meaning-making system as contrasted with a formal system, we can take it one step further. That step is implied in the notion of semiotic because there is no semiosis unless there's a social context. So on some level you could say that's a tautology, and it is. But let me foreground it just the same and say it is a social semiotic par excellence, and not only a social semiotic par excellence, but of a particular kind, namely that it is constitutive of social reality. For most of our dealings with the world, although of course there are other semiotic systems that we use, language is the most elaborated and most fully developed and ultimately culturally and cognitively and socially most significant semiotic system that we have. And in that function, it doesn't replicate social reality, but it creates it. It's constitutive of social reality. That's a huge, huge statement being made about a system. So just as I contrasted meaning-making with formal system, I'm going to contrast in the second part constitutive of social reality as contrasted with ancillary to social reality, which is the way in most cases the treatment that once you look a little bit more carefully as to how instruction and how a lot of talk about language instruction takes place, deep down it pushes it into the environment of language as an ancillary. Reality exists out there, and then we're going to express it through language rather than the other way around, that language actually constitutes social reality. Okay, and then of course the next thing will be further delimitation of the construct of globalization. We will be focusing on language learning and language development. What is showing up quite strongly, again, not that we didn't know it, but it is being foregrounded very, very much so now. The notion of language development is being dynamic and being nonlinear. Now, you may say, okay, that's a lot of applied linguistics gobbledygook, which to some extent I suppose it is, where you would, I hope, see the difference being made is the following. Most instructional programs are essentially hierarchical and additive. What do I mean by that? The typical lingo, and I'm purposely using that kind of wording, is accuracy, fluency, and complexity. And as people develop, we want a little more of those things. We want things a bit more accurate. We want them a bit more fluent. And we surely, maybe for most people, that's actually at the front. We want them more accurate. That kind of language use inherently is linear because it's just more of the same. More accurate, more fluent, more complex. Reality, however, is it ain't so. What is being foregrounded very, very strongly is dynamic, nonlinear language development. In fact, the word development, just as a side note, is essentially replacing the word acquisition. Now, for most outsiders, that may not even have caught your attention. But the word acquisition is seen as being problematic inasmuch as it seems to suggest that there is a fixed thing that can be acquired. And of course, that's the very message that one now wants to push aside and say, it ain't a fixed thing that can be acquired more, better, and in a linear fashion. Instead, it is, as I said before, a social semiotic resource, and that resource cannot be acquired. It can be only used in context. And none of us in any of the languages, including our native language, will ever have full command of the complete social semiotic resource that our languages, in fact, constitute. We will know certain parts of it, some of us more, some of us less, but it is only through the use of the resource itself that we have any access into the system. So there's nothing to be acquired and grasped in the sense as though it existed out there. And my final delimitation, of course, will be that I will then say, for our discussion, I am particularly interested in educational context, where one of the distinguishing characteristics of looking at language as a social semiotic resource is that educational knowledge in particular is hugely, hugely dependent on, implicated by, however way you want to express it, by language. We know that somebody is a competent professional in a certain academic field in particular when he or she knows how to use the language that a particular discipline prefers. So, educational knowing in particular is language-based. That has to be taken into consideration in any program, to my way of looking at it, that wishes to make any claims in higher education, that it is doing language development, language acquisition, however you want to phrase that, that is worth having. Okay? So, with that initial provocative statement here, that we are talking about adult instructed learning by literate learners. After all, they're sitting in colleges. And that we're talking about adult instructed learning by literate learners in the context of university foreign language programs. To me, these are very important distinguishers from language development, language programmatic considerations that are not located at the college level. So I will reiterate over and over again that colleges, I think, have obligations in that regard that are quite different than what is normally seen as language teaching and learning in other contexts. Okay, so I will make the following even more provocative claim. So take your notes as to where you want to shoot at the end. I will say, current conceptualizations of collegiate foreign language teaching and learning are insufficient for the age of globalization. And in and of themselves, these conceptualizations actually are not just missing the point. They're actually counterproductive in that they are creating a certain ceiling effect for college-level language learning in terms of both language and I could have said literary cultural content, because most collegiate foreign language departments nowadays are actually lit cult departments. They're not just narrow canonical literature anymore. That change has occurred quite well over the last 25 years or so. Everybody is a cultural studies department and has expanded the thematic areas that are on the table. And I will say that as currently positioned, the the conceptualization of foreign language teaching and learning is not supportive of those goals, and in fact is creating a ceiling effect. So, after having made that bold statement, I better put something on the table. And what I'm putting on the table is this. I will say, what should be thought of as a possibility of addressing the goals of collegiate language learning is a literacy orientation. And you may be surprised at this, because that is certainly not what applied linguistics has done in the past, and certainly foreign language teaching and learning hasn't, with a strong humanities orientation. My interest is in bringing those things together in a seamless fashion. And that kind of a literacy orientation within a strong humanities orientation focuses on, and of course there are any number of ways of describing it, but this is a short way of describing it, ability to interpret and to create something that I will call, for the sake of shorthand descriptors, oral and written texts. And what that would mean is that we're replacing the framing of language teaching and learning through the constructs of proficiency and through the construct of communicative competence, which are the dominant constructs in language teaching and learning over roughly the last 35 years. Now, you may say, okay, that's a word game, and to some extent it is. Like everything we do with language, it's a word game. But I do want to undergird it then in the remainder of the presentation, hopefully with some persuasive arguments and some fleshing out of what do I mean by a literacy orientation with a strong humanities framework underneath it, or orientation underneath it. What motivates this proposal? I'll make that very quick, but I do want to highlight some of these points. I think there are huge societal developments attendant to globalization. Let me remind you that I'm talking about language-related issues primarily, that need our attention and that demand a shift in this kind of thinking. And I will throw them all up like this. And the first of them is reshaping of notions of the nation state. Now you may think, what does this have to do with language teaching and learning? And I think it has absolutely everything to do with it, particularly the construction, and this is an ideology, let's put it on the table, the construction through a single national language, which was the foundation for any number of things that ultimately happened 19th century, 20th century in how we think about language. That linkage between the nation state and standardization of a language is all part of the ideology that needs to be looked at. Instead, of course, what we're getting is this dastardly multilingual environment. The more the merrier. Multilingual environment that challenges that very link between the nation state and the single, and I could have underlined, normed language, because as you can well imagine, as well as you know, particularly if you're literary cultural studies, the nation state was inherently interested in normed language and created canonical literature to support its ideas in that regard. All of those things are interlinked. We then have exactly that, the loss, or at least the diffusion, whatever you want to call it, of an exclusive focus on a national literary canon. These things are all related to each other. And we have increasingly now a blurring, a very fascinating blurring of the native and the foreign, and the ascendance of various forms of multilingualism. In many, many countries and with many people and in many people's individual lives, it is no longer clear what's native and what's foreign. particularly in educated contexts. Your native language may not be your educational language, and yet you as an adult professional will think of yourself and will think primarily in your educated language. So which is the more privileged one? The native language where you talk to grandma or the foreign language in which you conduct your entire professional life, and that is ultimately your identity out in the public sphere. So one more time, globalization has pushed that particular button very, very strongly. And what ends up happening is, and I already hinted at it, is we have all these languages taking their seats simultaneously in people's lives and taking different roles at different stages of people's lives, and that's the fascinating thing. These are dynamic phenomena. They shift intra-individually and they shift inter-individually in societies, where different languages that one has take on different functions. They don't replace each other, but they have a functional differentiation that's associated with it, which means let's keep them all, but let's use them in different contexts, which of course inherently results in multilingualism of various and sundry types. And then the last point may strike you as, what does this have to do with anything? Well, here's what I mean by saying that we have an increased need for tertiary education and the possible repositioning of language study, particularly in the US, where language study is not a core curricular concern in K through 12. There are relatively few places that actually have extended language development sequences in K through 12. The problematic but real situation occurs that higher education has to take a lion's share of language teaching and learning, and deep down you could argue the worst possible place gets the burden of making sure that society has some sort of multilingual capacity. By pointing to that fact, we then also find the fact that more and more people now do need to have university-level education. Therefore, the likelihood that folks show up at your doorstep for language teaching and learning is higher. An ever greater percentage of the population has to do that for obvious reasons. And therefore, your obligation towards that population that is now showing up, I think, is hugely increased as compared with what was the case before, where we sort of preached to the folks who were going to replicate us, right? Those days are over. The students that we have are not the ones that necessarily aspire to being like you or me, for that matter. Okay. So, globalization. To reiterate key points, we're looking now, and this is hugely important, we're looking at an increase in semiotic resources with multilingualism rather than a decrease. We're looking at an increase in the meaning-making potential that might be available to people. We are therefore, if language is in fact highly marked for ideological positions, which it is, we are therefore looking at an increase in ideological issues coming into play in various areas and environments of language use, which is pretty much all of our lives. And therefore, we have an increase in socio-political issues which need to be addressed. Unless foreign language instruction at the college level is able to incorporate those understandings, I think it's missing the boat. And I will say exactly that. The central role of the use of languages as meaning potentials, these are not fixities, these are potentials that are realized by the language users wherever they sit in global contexts. So what's the challenge? The challenge is the need to investigate language itself as a semiotic system. And what does that mean? That means as a meaning-making system, this is a review, in order to address, review again, these are my charm words, pervasive social, ideological, political questions, as well as issues of using multiple languages in contemporary globalized societies, and ultimately transcending this awareness to become aware of different ways of knowing. We have always said that. We have rarely delivered on it. It's a claim that anybody who is involved in language teaching has always made. Oh, well, when you learn foreign language X, you will get to appreciate different ways of looking at the world and different ways of knowing and different ways of being and all of that good stuff. I want to see the programs that have done that and have done it in a principled way. There will be very few, despite the claims that have always been made along those lines. Okay. It's challenging enough to do my blue points. And now things have just gotten even more complex, because we're now talking about all of this wonderful show in a multilingual environment where the dynamic aspects get even more dynamic. And that's where the fun begins. So here's what I want to do. I do want to focus then on the dynamic opportunities and challenges for foreign language programs in light of globalization. I want to provide a quick overview of the current state of affairs, and this is going to be critical on several levels, of foreign language teaching and learning in light of the impact of three dominant frameworks. And the ones that make the most sense are the proficiency framework, the standards framework, and of course the MLA report, which is about the only document that faculty in Lit Cult ever looked at. They didn't look at the proficiency framework. They also didn't look at the standards framework. If they looked at anything, if anything registered on the screen, it was the 2007 MLA report. Then I want to say, let's begin to imagine a more capacious conceptual framework for foreign language teaching and learning in the age of globalization. And I will divide that up into 7 different points. And then, although I wasn't asked to do that, I am going to take the privilege of saying, since you do have this nice environment of a new institute, what might any of this mean for the future work of the Institute here of World Languages, and how might all of the faculty, and I emphasize all with a great big bold-faced all, at UVA actually respond to some of these things? And as I said, just to make sure that we don't forget what the challenge is, we're trying to do this in a multilingual environment created by globalization. Okay, fun. Assessing the state of affairs of collegiate foreign language instruction, I think there's a good description. In a good number of cases, you might just as well call they are quite oblivious to the scene. They are perfectly comfortable where they are and are not going to engage in any soul-searching of what any of this means for their programs. It's just not something we're going to do. If they are cognizant of it, there are things going on, you will get various versions of this. A certain bunker mentality, you get resignation, this too shall pass, helplessness. I hear it all the time from faculty, and it's a little disconcerting in and of itself. And then, of course, here comes a really creative one, namely diverse forms of verbal refashioning of existing practices. In other words, we already do all these things, so don't tell me this. We are quite aware of the semiotic exuberance of globalization, and we attend to it quite nicely in our program, and so we really don't need to change anything. So keep those in mind. Where this shows up in the most interesting way is deep down a mostly uncritical acceptance of the goals, I put it as plural, of communicative language teaching, where communicative language teaching, whether people realize it or not, is generally conceptualized in terms of the interests of English language instruction. That's the elephant in the room that is not acknowledged, that a huge amount of what is out there actually reflects the interests of English language instruction, where that English language instruction is bolstered by the attractiveness of some of the major educational constructs underpinning English language instruction. Don't kid yourself. English, of course, is the global lingua franca, and there are many reasons why it rightly has that position. But that didn't happen all of its own. You have such folks as the British Council underneath it. You have the British Empire underneath it. You have American interests after the Second World War underneath it. There's a lot of policy stuff that went on underneath it that kind of nicely pushed things along. And as I say, I'm not going to counter-argue that's a reality. But in reverse, I'm also going to say the way it is very strongly influenced by the fact that this is part of the background of why we are where we are. And I will take it further, and I will say that globalization has some really nice features in as much as it pushes a long overdue reconceptualization or revitalization, if you want to call it that, of foreign language instruction. In other words, we knew these things all along, but we could more or less continue to ignore them because things were just fine. So don't rock the boat. It's not a big deal. We're perfectly capable of living our lives without the confrontation of globalization. I think that happy state of affairs is over. We could ignore it for quite some time, not anymore. And what that means is we will have to be very, very careful about where the kind of globalization research that clearly is dominating the discussion now, the research discussion, the theoretical discussion, with English as an international language, with English as the international lingua franca, that's what it is, they're looking at it very, very carefully, because we are rapidly in a situation in English of the late Roman period, you know, where, yes, of course, Latin was the lingua franca in the civilized world. By the same token, we started getting regions that said, not like this. We want our own way of doing this. And that's what's going on. And of course, people in applied linguistics that work in English as a second language, English as a foreign language, English as an international language, English as a lingua franca, each one of these things means different things in applied linguistics research. They are getting certain ideas about how to handle it. And you will find recommendations now in one word that you may find very quickly if you look into this literature at all is translingual competence or translanguaging. That's the newest kid on the block that everybody loves. If you want to have a look at it, which I found absolutely fascinating, look at I just got my most recent PMLA yesterday, the previous one. In the hallowed pages of the PMLA, the publications of the Modern Language Association, which could care less about language teaching and development on any day, all of a sudden, I couldn't believe my eyes when I opened the last one. I said, what's gotten into them to publish anything, and they actually went the lure of translanguaging, and I just saw the title. I said, who's this gutsy person? And lo and behold, it is the upcoming president of the American Association of Applied Linguistics, whom of course I know very well. So Paul Matsuda jumped into this discussion and said, watch it, because this is a very, very dangerous construct for foreign language instruction. And he decided to publish it in the PMLA. And the minute I saw it, I had just gotten back from Oxford, and I said, good for you. Put it out and say it. And so we had quite an email exchange back and forth, because I had just done a presentation at the University of Birmingham, like 10 days before, where by pure accident I had taken that as my focus too, and saying we need to watch what is being recommended here, because it doesn't apply to the foreign languages, it applies to ESL and EFL. There's a difference. So having said that, next question is then, what theoretical, what empirical research and instructional support might we provide for language professionals as they seek to accomplish the task of teaching in order to enable learning in a global world? So, globalization, as I have said, much of the literature actually has as its starting point the environment of English language teaching for communicative purposes. And this is what it looks like. It enshrines communicative abilities primarily understood as oral communication. Now, that's not to say that they don't have literacy phenomena. Of course they do. If you look at language for specific purposes, language for the professions, there's a huge literature by now in ESL and EFL that goes away from oral communication, but the underlying construct of communicative abilities is essentially one of oral communication, of oral transactional language use of two parties that are both present in the communication. Far from what I mentioned earlier, namely the interests of higher education, at least in my book, towards educational language use. Then, the reason why this is important is once you foreground communicative abilities, of course, you will proceduralize all of this. The reason why you have to proceduralize this is because in most cases, teacher training, quite frankly, is insufficient. So since that is so, and you just need to look at the typical teacher education programs for foreign languages, and despite NCATE and all sorts of other efforts, the preparation for foreign language teaching is very inadequate. So in order to overcome that, you will proceduralize it. And you don't need to know why you're doing it, just do it that way. And of course, then that is wonderfully ideologized. So then materials, pedagogies, and assessment are driven by this kind of proceduralization, and the insights about the nature of language that are driven by English really are no longer identified as such. But where you can see the impact of this is we have now reached the state where there is a nearly complete separation of what in the good old days, the bad old days, whichever way you want to go, used to fly under philology. Language teaching and learning in the humanistic tradition of language teaching and learning. And part of the reason why this is so, there are many reasons, of course, is that applied linguistics needed to establish itself as a science, as a respectable discipline, and the way it thought it should do that is by becoming a science. And the way it did that is by hooking up to psycholinguistic constructs. And so all of the metaphors, all of the language, all of the constructs that are used to talk about the phenomena, to research them, and to translate them into pedagogy are deep down driven by psycholinguistic research that has very little, if anything, to do with a humanistic tradition, which is, among many other reasons, one of the reasons for the split in foreign language departments between over here are the language folk and over here are the lit cult folk, and the twain will not know how to talk to each other because, as Claire Kamsch has said in any number of environments, we actually have two different discourse worlds. Over here is the psycholinguistic discourse world of second language acquisition, and over here is the discourse world of literary cultural studies, or as I have said on a naughty day, is at the bottom we have content-less language, and at the top we have language-less content. You take your pick, which of the two is worse. It's probably both that are pretty problematic as far as the coherence of a program is concerned. And the way you see it is that good foreign language teaching is modeled, is imagined, if you were to use Jesuit terminology, you would say the imagination is enshrined in the major frameworks such as proficiency in the standards. And at the early stages, little deliberate critical teaching of language together with cultural content takes place. We just do formal language instruction, never mind whether any of this means anything or whether any reasonably intelligent adult would ever wish to talk about it. We are not concerned about that in Intro 1 and Intro 2 and Intermediate 1 and 2. It's pretty uninteresting stuff as far as intellectual life is concerned. And then once we're done with that, of course, we are moving towards the more advanced courses, and all of a sudden we need to have a bridge course because what we did before is clearly insufficient. What needs to happen with things thereafter, so we have one more bridge, and they all lead nowhere, just like the bridge in Alaska. The bridge to nowhere, because deep down people really don't know what the bridge should be all about, because if they did, they would have started teaching that way already in the earlier courses, rather than waiting for the famous, infamous bridge course, which is too little too late. So there you have it. Those are the issues that frame most language departments in terms of the proficiency framework, which in the American context is actual ILR, OPI proficiency testing in its various, I should have added actually to 2013 because the newest iteration is that. We have the standards framework with an extension of it in 1996 in various versions thereof, and the famous, infamous MLA report of 2007. So let's quickly look. So there's no doubt that in the American language teaching and learning environment, proficiency is the actual OPI proficiency framework is it, less so the standards. And that's probably because the proficiency framework as originally conceptualized, and I am massively implicated, a good part of that stuff was written in my backyard with sandwiches being provided in 1982, is that the standards don't have an assessment attached to it. And the ability for teachers to understand the system is, in fact, massively enhanced in very, very good ways by having the assessment regime attached to it. And of course, the proficiency framework has an assessment framework attached to it. And plus, you can pat yourself on the back and go to your administrators and say, oh, we're assessing the learning outcomes of our students. What else do you want from us? Nothing. Right? So it serves many purposes, which then maintain that framework as the most viable one that we have. It has the greatest impact in secondary education. As you know, standards are now pretty much the curricular, the standards-based frameworks are pretty much the curricular framework in all 50 states, with very few exceptions. Standards having been derivative, I'll explain that briefly in a minute, of the proficiency framework. So by having a framework that is fleshed out primarily in secondary education, we immediately run the following risk. Higher education, for higher education, the proficiency approach, along with the standards approach, is insufficient, inasmuch as it does not explicitly theorize, it doesn't know how to do that, and incorporate in practice a humanities-oriented educational mission of college-level language departments. It doesn't do that. It's not interested in that. It's not that, it's wrong, whatever wrong is. It's just not an interest that is embedded in the proficiency framework. And there have been endless discussions about this to be read in many, many articles that are easy to find. So we then get this fusion of proficiency with the standards, so much so that communicative language teaching, which of course inherently does not need to equal proficiency, nevertheless became that, the default position. And then anything that we consider to be thinking and doing good language teaching is associated with this terminology. There is almost no good language teaching beyond that anybody has talked about, and I think that is problematic. Then, in the good old American context, the next lovely ideology that goes with it is focus on the learner. If you are not somebody that does learner-centered teaching, you're in trouble, right? That's another ideology. And I want to say, well, yes, of course, on some level you could say, what else is new? After all, them's the learners. They're supposed to be learning this. But what does learner-centeredness mean as an ideology? It essentially means, would you please be creative? Would you do this, that, and the third? And not the teacher in the center of the classroom, but the teacher move to the side. Let's not do any explicit teaching. That's a dangerous thing to do. Let us have our little darlings all be the ones that are in charge of the show. I think that is quite problematic because literacy is not developed in and of itself. In the native language, it doesn't happen in and of itself. It is massively instructed over at least 12 years. K through 12. That's what K through 12 education does. And then most colleges see wasn't good enough. We need to still do some of this in freshman year. They need to take a writing course, and some of them need to take a second writing course because they still can't do it. In other words, even in L1 learning, literacy development doesn't happen of its own. It needs to be developed, and it needs to be developed in a very carefully considered way, which in most cases is completely anathema to the ideologizing of learner-centeredness in foreign language instruction. Okay, then of course we need to all assess, right? Every institution is now in the assessment mode, and the quickest way to handle that is through the OPI, because we need to have national standards. We didn't just cook our own assessment up. The administration might not like that. So we go to an assessment regime that is actually undermining what would otherwise be our educational goals in higher education, at least in my way of looking at it. And of course, we can then use the OPI for evidence for washback, and we can say we have researched our efforts, and we have. But the question is that really what we should be doing? So here is my counterstatement again. Insufficient attention to literacy. It's not that these things are wrong. They're just foreshortening what higher education should be doing. Insufficient attention to literacy development, that is, to knowledge creation through language. We create knowledge by learning how to use the language of a discipline. There is no other way. Which is itself the goal of educational activity. You can take any intro to whatever course in college level. Deep down, the first course, Intro to Psychology, is a vocabulary acquisition course. to put it quite bluntly. This is this, and this is this, and we don't say it this way, but we say it this way. It looks no different than any advanced L2 instruction that I would be given. You have to say it this way if you want to be taken seriously in psychology, in theology, in political science, because this is what we do. And the discipline has developed its own preferred ways of doing things in light of the fact that it has certain interests. It discusses certain things. It finds certain questions interesting, others it doesn't find interesting. And in order to be able to answer those questions, we need highly developed language. So there you go. If I then want to create a program where literacy development in multiple languages is at issue, this needs to be front and center of the considerations. And then, of course, we have this wonderful phrasing of, in the proficiency framework, what students should know and be able to do. How many times have you heard that mantra? And then that got extended in the standards environment into personal, interpretive, and presentational modes. That was actually kind of an interesting discussion. I was on the steering committee of all of this standard stuff, so I know exactly when this nice idea came up. And then we then went to products, practices, and perspectives. Those of you that have looked at the standards are familiar with that. And then we went to the 5 C's and not the 7 C's. We did communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities as frames of reference. Okay, again, insufficiently theorized link between language use, between language development, and culture. And here we are with the MLA, which is actually sort of the saddest story. What was foregrounded was quite innovative, really quite smart. Translingual and transcultural competence. Unfortunately, nothing happened thereafter. Lots and lots of interest being expressed by departments. The MLA, in its wisdom, did not find it necessary or interesting to provide organizational leadership because, in my book, it's not that people weren't actually ready to do these things and still are interested in them. They don't know how. And that's not surprising, given the weight of all these frameworks that dominate the discussion. Unless you find a way of providing the ability on the ground for people to start realizing these things in their practice, this is a lot of talk, including mine. Okay, so here we are, very quickly. To summarize, we're going to imagine a suitable framework. And we're going to say we're interested in pursuing humanistic educational goals with emphasis on the development of multilingual literacies. And we would like to be able to do this in a 4-year integrated curriculum rather than a bifurcated one, where over here is language that has nothing to do with literary cultural content, and up there is language that is content that doesn't know how to deal with language acquisition. And the goal would then be to say we would like to usher in a long overdue reconceptualization and revitalization of foreign language instruction. Nice dream, but why not? Okay, here's the first one. So we go back to the way I started. We need to rethink the nature of language. I can be relatively brief on this since we've discussed it already. Language as a semiotic resource, as a potential that needs to be enacted. In other words, the potential for meaning making is in use. It will not sit anyplace else. And it is meaning making as a way of making sense of our physical world, our social world, and our inner worlds. And any meaning making, as we said, language as a social semiotic is in a social context, and that social context assumes certain shared assumptions. And the problem, in the positive sense, with globalization is that those shared assumptions are ever more fragile. and in fact have to be created because they don't necessarily exist. So now you can see, going back, why the nation state was very creative and very smart in saying, let's create a normed environment, and we will do away with all this variation, which of course existed before, because with a normed environment, we create shared assumption, top down. The nation state will come down and say, this is the way it's going to be. That's hugely advantageous for a state. To use language as the resource to make sure that we're all thinking the same things, whether we know it or not. That's no longer possible. The nation state cannot show up like that anymore. Those days are over. Which of course means that if we're going to contribute, we as language departments are going to contribute to this enterprise of globalization, we need to find ways of enabling our learners to understand this. So language learning aside, which of course we're interested in, that's part of it. But they must, these programs must enable their learners to develop this level of meta-awareness. It's not just the language itself, it's the awareness of how language go about making meanings. Because it is in that interchange of meaning making with folks that have different backgrounds, non-shared backgrounds in various and sundry ways, that you're going to have to communicate just the same. That means totally different ways of negotiating your position, your identity, your authority, your authorial voice, your whatever you want to call it. And you can, I would pull out any of the lit cult lingo. I'm quite familiar with it because that is exactly what's going on. And what is nifty about all of this now is that actually both applied linguists and lit cult people, if they ever were willing to talk to each other, might actually have a whole lot of shared things to say to each other. Okay. Rethink language learning in relation to language use and development. And we're talking in our context, not children learning a first language, not children learning a second language. We're talking about folks that are adult learners. That's what we're doing at the college level. And as I said earlier, what is showing up, and I won't spend any time with it, but if you happen to find yourself flipping through education or language acquisition related literature, you will see these as the major themes now. Chaos and complexity theory, as far away from linearity as you can possibly get. Dynamic systems theory, again, as far away as you can possibly get from linearity, and hierarchical ways of thinking and development, and sociocultural theory, a la Bakhtin, Vygotsky, any of those folks. So there again, I think the moment is unusually opportune for everybody to be talking about things that should actually be of interest for both sides. And the pedagogical considerations would be exactly that. We would highlight that the enterprise is about meaning making. We would highlight the fact that deep down, I am not interested in enabling you to be more accurate and more fluent and more complex. Yes, I am. But deep down, I am interested in enabling you to make choices. Choices in meaning making that fit your particular situation. And it is my job to give you the resources to make choices rather than you parroting something that I have in mind. So rather than saying, please say that your brother is 3 years older than you are, and the poor person saying, but I don't have a brother, say it just the same. Right? Because that's the way it is. I need that form in this classroom right now, and so it is. No. Make choices that make sense for you as a person that is reasonably intelligent and might actually have something reasonably interesting to say. And those choices are not with regard to fixities of language. Those days are over if we ever had them, but within typicalities. Typicalities of language use, and it is your job to point out to them what those typicalities are. foster an awareness, which goes right with typicalities, flexibility of patterns within boundaries. That's the name of the game. Not anything goes a la learner-centered creativeness, just say anything you want to. No. The best learning environment is an awareness of the boundaries of typicalities and within them flexibility and choices, because that's where learning occurs. You can't learn to swim in the ocean, but you can learn to swim in that little area at the edge of the ocean where you might actually be able to succeed, because the name of the game is you need to succeed, or it is my job to find an environment here in this very complex situation where you will be successful. I want you to succeed at this. And that's what I need to do to enable you to be successful. And I've already said that. Creativity as being bounded by and occurring within social norms, which are inherently flexible and variable. They're not fixed. Okay, here we are. How do we do that? We take oral and written texts. So texts, make sure that you see my oral and written as sites for semiotic engagement in production and interpretation, therefore as sites for learning. Then we need to specify the roles of those texts in context. Texts never exist any place other than in particular contexts. It is that awareness that needs to be created. What's the context of situation and what's the context of culture? Any of you that have written anthropology will see the overtones of Malinowski here. Context of culture and context of situation. Engage them in semiotic work rather than just saying accuracy, fluency, complexity. What do I mean by that? And this is really fun. Inferring the context from the text and creating the text that fits a context. So the entire instructional approach is, in what particular environment might this oral or written text be a real text? What can we infer about the social context in which this text resides? And in reverse, now that you are creating certain meta-awarenesses about how language works as a semiotic system, could you then begin to create oral and written texts that fit certain contexts that I will specify for you? That's what I mean by making choices. Okay? And what that means is we will go to totally different vocabulary. We will look at registers, and we will look at genre, where registers are bundles of typicalities, and we will introduce genre as typified social action that has certain stages and obligatory and optional macro and micro lexicogrammatical features. A genre unfolds in stages, and we know that it is a certain genre because it has certain preferred, typical, probabilistic macro features and probabilistic micro features. Notice not lexicon and grammar separately, but always lexicogrammar. There is, even theoretical, no way of distinguishing grammar from lexicon. It's always lexicogrammar. Good point to be made. Okay. Highlight that language learning, language use, and language development about the expansion of registerial and generic repertoires. If somebody were to ask you, what's your program about? In the past, we would have said better accuracy, better fluency, more complexity. Out. What we're interested in, if we're looking at a literacy orientation, is an expansion of your repertoire as to what registers you can handle and what genre you can handle. That would then give you an approach to literacy development in multiple languages that would be worth pursuing. Emphasize that. So lexicogrammatical features, and this is a technical term, realize registers and genre. It's not a causative one-to-one relationship. It's a relationship of realization. And then negotiate the statement of goals, implicitly akin to desired forms of language use and norms, in light of the dynamic nature of language development. That's a tricky thing, because on one level, we're saying all of this stuff is dynamic, and yet we're in an instructional program. how do you negotiate that? How do you, they all sit in the same classroom, and we need to recognize the fact that this is dynamic and different for different learners, and yet we're all sitting in the same classroom, and I'm teaching you all in the same classroom. How do I negotiate that I have certain goals, that I am going to pursue those goals pretty rigorously, and yet allow you to develop dynamically within that environment? It's a much more sophisticated, a much more challenging, but ultimately a much more interesting environment within which to teach. Goals are flexible norms, and I purposely use norms here, even as they must be imbued with the necessary social reality. So things have just gotten more complex, and they've gotten more interesting. So I will say something that some of you who know me have heard me say before. I am a firm believer in curriculum development precisely for that reason, although that seems a little contradictory. Curriculum for most people is this fixed thing that we're supposed to be adhering to. No, 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 no. Curriculum is a set of principles that have a certain trajectory towards developing text types and register abilities, where text type and registers occupy the middle ground between a particular text and the system. Text types sit in the middle, where the lexicogrammatical resources necessary for realizing the text and text types are available and are learnable. The most important thing to watch for: what can they learn at what particular stage within the trajectory? There's no point in feeding them something that they can't learn. Or in reverse, there is no point in continuing to do interesting communicative things, quote unquote, that don't lead to further development. It's a big waste of time. And that is what goes on in a lot of language programs, because too few programs have thought through, how do we attain advanced levels of ability? Very little thinking is being given to that. So we would then have to say, we need to explore major genre types in the curriculum as a way of learning language and content simultaneously. There is no splitting of the two, where one way of conceptualizing this from the language development standpoint is we begin with the narrative genre, which makes an enormous amount of sense. Recount, act count, storying. Then we gradually move to the explaining genre, where the major distinction, these are major genre families: factorial explanation, which would be, we have phenomenon X, what factors led to it? And consequential explanation, where we would say we have phenomenon X, and what are the consequences of that, say, take climate change and like, and if we continue the way we're doing things, we're going to be in real trouble. Both of those those explaining genre need totally different linguistic resources, and yet they are central to public discourse, which of course is what we are trying to teach them. And finally, we would, if all goes right, go to the arguing genre, which are typically associated with academic language use, exposition, discussion, challenge, interpretation, and the like. And this would be a way of conceptualizing 4 years of undergraduate education, quite frankly, actually going into graduate education. Because particularly in the first year of graduate study, I can tell you from our experience, and I don't think our experience is any better or any worse than yours, is first-year graduate students can't really handle this yet in the foreign language in a really sophisticated way. And yet you need it. So we actually came to that kind of shocking conclusion after we had done our undergraduate work for a good number of years. One bright day, somebody said, you know, some of our graduate students could use some of that stuff. So we adapted accordingly, and particularly for the first year of graduate studies, since everything is done in German. Okay, second one would be, let's rethink the proposal to do this in a genre-based way. Genre has two interesting characteristics. As I hinted at earlier on one level, it's a limiting context in order to enhance the possibility of learning. You can't do everything, but you should be able to do this. And at the same time, it's an invitation to dynamic meaning making, because within the genre, there's lots and lots and lots of flexibility. So you can be creative, you can be all of these things, but you can't be creative out of the bounds. Anybody that has ever read Bakhtin will immediately see the echoes to that, because that's exactly what you've got there. So the central role of choice in textual meaning making, conceptualized as enhancing learning, and if you wanted to use a more preferred term now, development. So we establish goals in line with the humanities and cultural studies for higher education programs, and we will go beyond the quotidian orality that characterizes the proficiency approach. We will embrace a multilingual literacy, and we will present a programmatic trajectory that enables the development of language performance abilities for the public sphere, which is one way of saying what the trajectory is. Information access, interpretation, creation of language for the public sphere, action on information in public and private lives, and various forms of civic engagement, the world of work, where the world of work would include professional and academic environments. And there we are. We want to integrate at all points all modalities. There is no separation of reading and writing and speaking and listening. There are no reasonable ways of separating those things. All the more so as adult literate learners benefit most from having this integrated. In fact, benefit most, believe it or not, from the environment of reading and writing because they have time on their side. Which is not to say that the instruction isn't focused on speaking. Of course it is. But you will find ways of integrating reading, writing, and speaking constantly in order to push them towards as much of this ability as you possibly can within the dreadfully short period of time that's available. So you develop curricula that embrace various continua, because after all, a curriculum is a trajectory. Embrace a movement from orality to literacy, from the dialogicality of oral interaction to the dialogicality of written interaction, contrary to what has always been said that communication and conversation is dialogical and written is monological. Completely wrong. It's just that the dialogicality of oral language is between the two of us in the same room, and the dialogicality of written language is that language itself must be able to produce the dialogical reader in the text, so to speak, as lit cult people call it. This is very much Bakhtin. Embrace a movement from the discourses of familiarity to the discourses of public life. This is Jim G. Exemplify and instantiate two major forms of semiosis, what's otherwise called congruent and synoptic. That's Bourdieu, if you want to, the inside view and the outside view. From flow to the thinginess of the world, as Halliday so nicely described it. That is what we do in academic language use, and explore the consequences of that across the entire development, within the clauses, across clauses, in order to create coherence, cohesion, and ultimately knowledge construction, because that's really what's going on in different forms of meaning making. Okay. If you have time still in your undergraduate program, most likely it's going to push into the graduate program. You would then look at dialogicality of language as a system across historical spaces, because the system itself is dialogical. It speaks to itself. We used to think things in the 18th century like this, but in the 21st century, we think it like that. So the construct of dialogicality, which is a lovely one in Bakhtinian heteroglossic ways of looking at things, actually works very well for reconceptualization of the entire enterprise. I will not harass you with this lengthily, but it's a graph that I developed for a research paper that I wrote just to briefly show you what I'm talking about. On the left side, we have the instance. On the right side, we have the potential. The trajectory would be from the instance of the text, because you don't experience the language system ever. You only experience a text. That's the only place that you will be able to get your teeth into. But from the curricular standpoint, you can't just choose any old text. You don't have that much time. If we had 12 or 13 or 14 years, we could waste our time like that, but we don't. We have pathetic number of years to accomplish this miracle. So what we need to choose very well is instant types or genre in terms of register, and then choose texts that are particularly good examples of a text type, otherwise known as a genre. And that would then, if all goes well, give us a fighting chance to enable our learners to actually move up remarkably quickly, if I can persuade you of that argument. So here we are. The challenge for foreign language teaching in the age of globalization is ultimately the challenge of enabling students to develop a heightened awareness of the nature of meaning making through language. Then the ability to act, because we're social animals, on this awareness as they continue to expand their meaning making resources in an ever expanding set of social contexts. And then, since this enterprise deep down is an ethical one, and the ability to take responsibility. How many conflicts have we heard of late in the multilingual environment where folks did not take responsibility for their language-based actions, because language is action. And you can't just say any old something. It will have consequences. And that level of awareness has to be created in language programs in higher education that I think are worth their being maintained by the university, because it is by having the ability to take responsibility for their language-based actions, they're really showing a kind of acceptance of ethical norms. In the past, it was formal norms that we pushed. We're now saying there are ethical norms here involved in the semiotically exuberant age of globalization. Now, I could stop here, but I appended to it 2 additional slides. Some concluding thoughts for the Institute, and here are some of them. The current, oftentimes stalemated situation regarding innovative curricular thinking is less a matter of not realizing the need for change than it is not being able to imagine and theorize and implement change. We don't know how, and why should we? There is not a whole lot that has been made available, and there are lots of reasons why this is so. What does that mean? To me, it would mean the need for focused and extended engagement. One-shot affairs will not do it. By all members of a department, and I should have said that in red, in order to develop an articulated curriculum that integrates language and content learning as a development of multiple literacies. This is not a matter for the language folk. It is also a matter for all the rest of the folk in the department. It's not going to happen unless the entire faculty sits down and talks about these things. And the need to engage graduate students in this way, because after all, they're the folks that are going to carry this forward, thinking about language and language development in such a fashion. And my second slide is this. The opportunity to contribute to a university discussion about learning goals as humanistic goals that involve the ability to interpret and create oral and written texts. How many times have you heard critical thinking? I always say, when was the last time you thought uncritically? Well, I suppose many people do, but I find it an empty verbiage, another one of those ideologized things that administration likes, because they don't, nobody has helped them think of this as a language-based enterprise, which is this, to me, this ability to interpret and create oral and written texts is the signature contribution of the humanities. made even more indispensable in the age of globalization. That needs to be said across campus 100 times. Department X does not teach le and la and le, or der and die and das. Department X teaches how to interpret and create oral and written text for a multilingual environment, and then knows how to shape assessment accordingly in terms of meaning making, particularly in speaking, reading, and writing. And that assessment will then provide you very interesting proof of the kind of critical thinking that is valued in the humanities, rather than the usually quite limited notions of critical thinking that abound in administration speak. Thank you very much.